Moving into my new home seemed perfect, until Margaret Templeton, the power-hungry HOA president, decided she owned the neighborhood. When she trespassed and destroyed my fence, she thought she could break me. But she was wrong. The pounding on my front door was relentless, sharp, entitled, and demanding. It was the kind of knock that didn't just request attention, it insisted on obedience. I set down my coffee with a sigh, already knowing who it was before I even reached the peephole. Through the small glass circle, I saw her. Margaret Templeton, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed queen and reigning HOA president. Short, wiry, and with a permanent scowl etched into her face, she was the human embodiment of a gavel, always ready to strike down whatever she deemed unworthy of her precious community. I unlocked the door but didn't open it fully, keeping my foot against the frame. "Morning, Marge. Something wrong?" Her lips pursed so tightly they practically disappeared. "We need to talk about your fence." I exhaled through my nose. "Ah, so it begins. See, when I bought this house 6 months ago, I knew there was an HOA, but I hadn't expected it to be a full-blown dictatorship. Within the first week, I'd received a friendly reminder about my trash bins being visible from the street. A few days later, another notice, this time about the color of my mailbox not being in approved neutral tones. But this was the moment I had been waiting for. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "What about it?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "It's too tall. HOA regulations state fences must not exceed 6 feet, yet yours is clearly 8. And," she continued, flipping through a stack of laminated papers, "it was not pre-approved by the board." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "It was here when I bought the house." "That doesn't matter," she snapped, shoving one of the laminated sheets toward me. "You, as the current homeowner, are responsible for ensuring compliance. This is a violation." I took the paper but barely glanced at it. "I see. And what exactly do you want me to do?" "Submit an official request for modification," she said, tilting her nose up. "The HOA will review it, and if approved, you'll have 30 days to lower the fence." "And if I don't?" Margaret's lips curled into a smug grin. "Fines. And possible legal action." There it was. The real power play. Margaret didn't just enforce rules. She thrived on control. I should have seen this coming. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Dawson, had warned me about the HOA before he left. "They'll find something to come after you for," he had said, shaking his head. "Margaret's the worst of them." I glanced back at my fence, standing tall and sturdy, separating my property from the rest of the world. It wasn't just a fence. It was my boundary, both literal and metaphorical, and I wasn't about to let some overzealous neighborhood tyrant dictate what I could and couldn't have on my own land. I turned back to her and smiled. "I'm not lowering the fence." Margaret's eyes twitched. "Excuse me?" I said, "I'm not lowering the fence." Silence. Then a slow, controlled breath from her nose. "You don't have a choice." "Actually, I do," I said, crossing my arms. "This fence was here before I moved in. It was built years ago, long before your little rule changes. So unless you can prove that it violates the original HOA agreement, I think I'll keep it." For the first time, Margaret faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'll have to check the records," she said stiffly. "You do that," I said, stepping back and shutting the door. But something told me this wasn't over. Days passed, and I thought maybe, just maybe, Margaret had moved on to torment someone else. But I was wrong. It started small. A notice on my door. Then another. Then another. Violation warning. Unauthorized fence height. Second notice. Failure to comply. Final warning. Immediate action required. Then came the fines. $50, then $100, then $250. I ignored them all. Margaret could send all the letters she wanted. I wasn't budging. Then one morning, I stepped outside to find a bright orange sign staked into my front yard. Notice of HOA enforcement action. I ripped it out of the ground, heart pounding. This was ridiculous. Was she really this obsessed with a damn fence? I stormed back inside and grabbed my phone, dialing the HOA office. It rang twice before a saccharine voice answered. "Maplewood HOA, how can I assist you?" This is Jake Carter. I need to speak to Margaret. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, but Mrs. Templeton is unavailable at the moment. Would you like to leave a message? No, I said through gritted teeth. Just tell her to stop harassing me about the fence. I hung up and exhaled sharply. This was getting out of hand. That night, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. As I passed house after house, I noticed something strange. Other fences. Some were just as tall as mine. Others had unauthorized paint colors or decorations that clearly violated HOA guidelines. Yet there were no warning signs, no orange notices, no fines. It wasn't about the fence. It was about me. Margaret had targeted me. I clenched my fists. If she wanted a fight, I'd give her one. But the battle hadn't even started yet, because when I got home, I found something that made my blood run cold. My back gate was wide open, and I never left it open. Margaret had been on my property. My heart pounded as I stood frozen on my back porch, staring at the open gate. A chill ran down my spine. There was no way I had left it like that. I always made sure to lock it. Always. I stepped forward cautiously, scanning my yard. Everything looked the same. The neatly trimmed grass, the patio furniture, the small shed in the corner. But something felt off, like someone had been here, walking around, surveying. I clenched my fists. Margaret. That woman had the audacity to step onto my property. I strode down to the gate and slammed it shut, locking it. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just about some HOA rule anymore. This was personal. I marched back inside, grabbed my phone, and pulled up her number. I had never called her directly before, but at this point I didn't care. I hit dial. It rang and rang and rang. Then just as I was about to hang up, the call connected. Hello. Margaret's voice was clipped, annoyed, as if I were an inconvenience rather than a homeowner she had just trespassed against. You were on my property, I said, my voice low and steady. A pause, then, in that irritatingly smug tone, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Margaret, I snapped. My back gate was open, and I know damn well I locked it. So unless you can tell me why your name is on every single one of those violation notices stuck to my door, I'm going to assume it was you. Her silence was almost satisfying. Almost. Then she laughed, a condescending, amused little chuckle. Mr. Carter, I suggest you watch your tone. You're part of this community, and you need to follow the rules like everyone else. That's funny, I shot back, because I walked around the neighborhood last night, and guess what? Other fences are just as tall as mine, but I don't see bright orange warnings in their yards. So tell me, Margaret, why am I the only one getting harassed? Her voice turned icy. You're making baseless accusations. The HOA board reviews all violations, not just me. Then maybe I should talk to the board directly, I said. See what they think about an HOA president trespassing on private property. She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. You have no proof, she said, her voice quieter now. No, I admitted, but I will. I hung up. If Margaret thought she could bully me into submission, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The next morning I had a plan. First I installed security cameras, one facing my driveway, another watching my backyard. If she tried anything again, I'd have her on tape. Second, I decided it was time to meet my neighbors. If Margaret was targeting me, I needed to know why. And who better to ask than the people who had lived here longer than I had? I started with Mr. Dawson, the previous owner of my house. He still lived in the neighborhood, just a few streets over, in a smaller townhouse. When he opened the door, he squinted at me, then broke into a wide grin. Well, if it isn't the poor soul who bought my house, he chuckled. Let me guess, Margaret? I sighed. She's relentless. Dawson shook his head. Should have warned you better, kid. Margaret doesn't just enforce HOA rules. She creates them. If she wants someone out, she'll make their life a living hell. I frowned. Why would she want me out? He hesitated. I don't know for sure, but I do know she has her favorites. The people who kiss up to her, they get away with everything. But folks who push back, they become her next target. My stomach twisted. So this isn't about my fence. Nope, Dawson said. It's about control. I left his house with a pit in my stomach. Margaret wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a regime, and I had just put myself on her enemy list. That night, I sat on my couch watching the live feed from my security cameras on my phone. 11 p.m. Nothing. 12:30 a.m. Still quiet. 2:15 a.m. Movement. I sat up, my pulse spiking. The backyard camera had caught something, a shadow moving near my fence. I rewound the footage and played it again. A figure, small, wiry, sneaking. Margaret. My hands tightened around my phone. She was creeping along my fence, inspecting it, looking for… what? A weakness? A way in? Then suddenly, she pulled out a hammer. My breath caught. What the hell was she… Before I could process it, she swung, hard, right at one of my fence posts. Crack. I bolted up, grabbing my jacket and keys. Oh, she was done. I stormed outside, flashlight in hand, and marched straight to my backyard. Margaret! I shouted, shining the beam on her. She flinched like a guilty raccoon caught in a trash can, her hammer still raised in the air. Jake! She gasped, feigning surprise. What are you doing out here? What am I doing out here? I barked. What the hell are you doing on my property with a hammer? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then she straightened her shoulders. I was just inspecting a suspected violation. As HOA president, I have the right to… No, you don't, I snapped. You have the right to send me a letter. You do not have the right to sneak onto my property in the middle of the night like some lunatic with a weapon. She scowled. I don't appreciate your tone, young man. I don't appreciate you trespassing, I shot back. She folded her arms. Your fence is still in violation. I have you on camera. Her face was drained of color. I pulled out my phone and played the footage. There she was, clear as day, vandalizing my property. This is illegal, Margaret, I said, my voice cold. And I'm done playing nice. She took a step forward, then hesitated. You wouldn't. Try me. Her jaw clenched. Fine. She lifted her chin, trying to regain control of the situation. But you'll regret this, Mr. Carter. I narrowed my eyes. That a threat? She smiled. A promise. Then she turned and walked away. I stood there, heart pounding, watching her retreat into the darkness. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because Margaret wasn't just playing a game anymore. She was waging war. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret standing in my yard, hammer raised like some deranged suburban warlord. I kept replaying the footage over and over, wondering what the hell she had been trying to accomplish. If she thought damaging my fence would force me to comply, she was dead wrong. By the time morning rolled around, I had already drafted an email to the police, including screenshots from my security camera footage as evidence. I didn't care how much power she thought she had in the HOA. She had broken the law, and I was going to make sure she faced consequences. But before I could hit send, a loud thump against my front door made me jump. I walked over cautiously and pulled it open. On my porch sat a large sealed envelope. No name, no return address. Just my own name scrawled in aggressive, capital letters. I tore it open, my stomach twisting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in bold font. Notice of HOA-initiated property review. Effective immediately, the Maplewood HOA board would be conducting a full compliance audit of my home. Any and all violations, no matter how minor, would be documented and subject to fines or legal action. And at the bottom, Margaret's signature, bold and smug as hell. She was retaliating. I exhaled through gritted teeth. This wasn't just about the fence anymore. Margaret had declared war. Fine, let's play. By noon, I had already taken the next step. I drove straight to the local police station, walked in, and filed a trespassing and vandalism report against Margaret Templeton. The officer on duty, a tired-looking guy named Officer Miller, listened carefully as I explained everything. When I showed him the footage, he let out a low whistle. Damn, she really came after that fence, huh? She's been harassing me for weeks, I said. This was just the latest stunt. Miller nodded. You did the right thing reporting it. We'll be paying her a visit. That made me feel a little better. But as I drove home, I had the nagging feeling that Margaret wasn't the type to back down just because the police knocked on her door. And I was right. That evening, the HOA board arrived. 3 people dressed like they were heading to a corporate interview stood on my lawn with clipboards in hand. And leading them? Margaret, of course. I walked outside, arms crossed. "What the hell is this?" Margaret gave me a syrupy, sweet smile. "Just a routine compliance check, Mr. Carter. HOA policy." I glanced at the other board members, 2 men and a woman, all avoiding my gaze like guilty kids caught cheating on a test. They knew this was personal. Still, I let them do their little inspection charade. They walked around my property, pretending to scrutinize every detail. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, resisting the urge to laugh when they jotted down notes on the most ridiculous things. A small weed in my flower bed? Violation. My mailbox was slightly crooked? Violation. A garden gnome by my front steps? Unauthorized lawn decoration. Margaret's smile grew wider with every imaginary infraction she found. When they finally finished, she turned back to me. "You'll receive an official notice of violations within the next 48 hours. Failure to address them will result in escalating fines." I arched an eyebrow. "That's so?" "Yes." She took a step forward. "You can still avoid all this, you know. Just lower the fence." I let out a slow chuckle. "That's never going to happen." Margaret's eye twitched. "Then you'll regret it." She turned sharply on her heel and marched off with her board members trailing behind like loyal subjects. But as she walked away, I noticed something. One of the men, a tall, stocky guy with graying hair, glanced back at me, his face hesitant. He knew this was wrong, and that gave me an idea. The next morning, I tracked him down. His name was Alan Pearson, and according to the HOA website, he was the vice president of the board. If anyone could tell me what was going on behind the scenes, it was him. I caught him outside his house as he was watering his lawn. "Alan," I called, walking up his driveway. "Got a minute?" He looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder like Margaret might be lurking in the bushes. I don't think I should be talking to you." "Come on, man," I said. "You know this is all bull. Margaret's out for blood, and you're letting her get away with it." Alan sighed, lowering the hose. "Look, it's complicated, okay? Margaret runs the HOA like a damn dictatorship. She has connections with the city council. If I push back too hard, she'll have me removed." I frowned. "Then why stay on the board at all?" He hesitated. Then after a moment he muttered, "Because someone has to keep her in check." That surprised me. "So you don't actually support what she's doing?" He let out a humorless laugh. "God, no. The woman's a power-hungry control freak. But if I step down, she'll just replace me with someone worse. At least this way, I can stop her from going completely off the rails." I considered that for a moment. Then an idea struck. "What if you help take her down?" I asked. Alan's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "Come on, Alan," I pressed. "You know she's abusing her position. If enough board members turn against her, we can get her removed." He hesitated, jaw tightening. "That's not easy. She has the bylaws locked down tight. Then we find a way around them." Alan rubbed his forehead. "You don't know what you're asking, man. Margaret is vindictive. If she finds out, she already declared war on me," I cut in. "I have nothing to lose." He stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'm in." That night, Alan gave me everything. He forwarded me emails, board meeting minutes, and HOA documents proving that Margaret had been selectively enforcing rules and illegally issuing fines without proper board approval. It was a goldmine. And the best part? Some of it showed that she had been funneling HOA funds for administrative costs, which just so happened to include expensive dinners, spa visits, and personal home upgrades. Margaret wasn't just a control freak, she was a crook. I grinned. "This is perfect." Alan still looked uneasy. "Be careful with this. If she finds out we're working together—" "She won't," I assured him. At least that's what I thought. But the very next day, all hell broke loose. Because when I stepped outside that morning, I found something that made my blood boil. My fence? Gone. Completely torn down in the middle of the night. And in its place, a freshly printed HOA notice. Removal of unauthorized structure completed per HOA enforcement policy. Do not rebuild without approval. And beneath it, in big, bold letters, signed Margaret Templeton. That was it. Margaret had just crossed the line. She wanted a war. She was about to get one. I stood frozen in my yard, fists clenched, rage boiling in my chest. My fence, gone. The only thing left were splintered posts sticking out of the ground like broken teeth. Margaret had actually done it. She had crossed the final line, destroying my property under the guise of HOA enforcement. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she had won. She was dead wrong. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos of the destruction, then stormed back inside. I didn't even hesitate. I went straight to my laptop and opened up the emails Alan had given me. Illegal fines, misuse of HOA funds, selective enforcement. It was all here. Concrete evidence of Margaret's corruption. I was done playing defense. It was time to take her down. My first move? The police. I forwarded the fence destruction photos and the security footage of her trespassing to Officer Miller. Within minutes, he called me back. "Mr. Carter, I was just about to follow up with you on your last report," he said. "But this is vandalism and destruction of property. We'll be paying Margaret a visit today." I grinned. Perfect. But that was just step one. While the police handled the criminal side, I had another plan. Step 2, exposing Margaret publicly. I spent the next 2 hours compiling everything I had into a single scathing email and sent it out to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The subject line? Margaret Templeton is corrupt, proof attached. Inside, I laid everything out. Her illegal fines, her misuse of funds, her trespassing, her destruction of my fence. Screenshots, receipts, emails, everything. Then to top it off, I included a call to action. If you're sick of Margaret's dictatorship, join me at the next HOA meeting. It's time to vote her out. And then, for good measure, I posted printed copies on every single HOA bulletin board in the neighborhood. If Margaret thought she could bully me into silence, she was about to find out just how loud I could be. I didn't have to wait long for a response. Within an hour, my phone was blowing up. Neighbors started reaching out. Some were furious at Margaret. Others admitted they had been too afraid to speak up until now. And then Alan called. "Dude," he said, his voice almost breathless with excitement, "you just started a goddamn revolution." And then, right on cue, Margaret showed up. I heard the screech of tires outside and looked out my window. Her car had just pulled into my driveway, and she practically launched herself out of it. She stormed toward my front door like an angry bull in a pantsuit. I smirked. Showtime. I stepped outside just as she reached my porch. Her face was bright red, her nostrils flaring. "You listen to me, you little—" "Careful, Margaret," I interrupted, folding my arms. "I'm recording this conversation." I tapped my phone, which was very visibly capturing everything. She hesitated for a split second, but she was too furious to stop. "You think you can slander me like this?" she hissed. "You think you can turn this neighborhood against me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." I tilted my head. "You mean the same neighborhood you've been stealing from?" I shot back. "The same people you've been harassing with bogus fines?" Her hands shook. "You don't have proof." "Oh, but I do," I said, grinning. "And so does the entire neighborhood." She gasped. You sent that email?" I nodded. "And I posted the documents on every community board." Her eyes bulged. "You absolute—" Before she could finish her meltdown, 2 police cars pulled up. Margaret froze. I turned to see Officer Miller stepping out of his car, a serious expression on his face. "Mrs. Templeton," he called, approaching, "we need to have a word with you." Margaret whipped around, eyes wide. "What? This is harassment. I am the HOA president, and—" Miller cut her off. "And you've been accused of trespassing, vandalism, and property damage." He held up a printout of my security footage, showing her in my backyard with the hammer. Margaret's face turned ghost white. "This is a misunderstanding," she shrieked. I was enforcing HOA rules." Miller shook his head. "No, ma'am. You were committing a crime." I crossed my arms. Guess those HOA bylaws don't override the law, huh? Margaret glared daggers at me, but for the first time, she looked scared. Miller sighed. Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I moved in, she had no comeback. And then, just as I thought she might try to talk her way out of it, she bolted, like full-on ran. I barely held in my laughter as two officers chased her down my driveway, finally catching her before she made it to her car. Margaret Templeton, the almighty HOA tyrant, was being handcuffed on my front lawn. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, watching the spectacle unfold. Some whispered. Others looked relieved. And then finally Alan walked up beside me. You did it, he muttered. I grinned. We did it. Margaret screamed every curse in the book as they loaded her into the police car. But it didn't matter, because her reign was officially over. But the story didn't end there. With Margaret arrested and the HOA scandal now fully exposed, the neighborhood came together to clean up her mess. At the next HOA meeting, the biggest turnout in the history of the neighborhood, Margaret was officially voted out. Alan, he was elected as the new HOA president, one that people actually trusted. And me, I rebuilt my fence, even taller than before, just to make a point. A week later, as I was enjoying a beer on my newly fenced-in patio, Alan stopped by. He leaned against the post, shaking his head with a smirk. Never thought I'd see the day. Margaret in handcuffs? I chuckled. Yeah, that was a sight. Alan laughed. Then his expression turned a little more serious. You know, the HOA was never meant to be like this, he said. It was supposed to help the community, not control it. I nodded. Then maybe it's time to fix it. And we did. The neighborhood changed after that. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore. The HOA actually worked for the community, instead of terrorizing it. And as for Margaret, well, let's just say she was never allowed in a leadership position again. The queen had fallen, and damn did it feel good. Margaret Templeton was done for. Her reign of terror had crumbled in the most glorious way possible, in handcuffs, screaming like a banshee, in full view of the very people she had tormented for years. But while I should have been celebrating, something told me it wasn't over yet. Because people like Margaret, they don't go down quietly. And I was right. A week after her arrest, just when I thought I could finally enjoy my life without looking over my shoulder, my lawyer called. Brace yourself, he said. Margaret's suing you for defamation. I nearly dropped my coffee. You're joking. Wish I was. I laughed. A short, bitter chuckle. The sheer audacity of this woman. She's really trying to sue me after getting arrested on my property? I said, shaking my head. Unbelievable. She claims your email ruined her reputation, my lawyer explained, that your accusations were false and malicious. Oh, you mean the accusations backed up by emails, bank records, and literal video evidence? I shot back. Exactly, he said, which is why she's not going to win. But people like Margaret don't care about winning. This is about making your life hell. I exhaled slowly. Of course it was. Margaret wasn't after money. She was after revenge. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to end her. The lawsuit backfired spectacularly. Margaret's attempt to paint herself as the victim completely imploded the second my lawyer dragged her finances into court. See, suing me meant opening up her own records for scrutiny. And thanks to Alan's help, we had a paper trail a mile long showing exactly how she had been stealing from the HOA. Illegal fines, unauthorized administrative expenses, even a sketchy contract with a landscaping company that, surprise, surprise, was owned by her nephew. Her own lawyer looked horrified when this all came out. And when the judge saw my security footage of her trespassing, vandalizing my fence, and literally threatening me on my own property, let's just say Margaret's case fell apart instantly. Not only did the judge throw out her lawsuit, but he recommended that the HOA press charges for embezzlement. But the real final blow came the next morning. I was sipping my coffee on my porch, enjoying the quiet, when Alan showed up with a huge grin on his face. Turn on the news, he said, barely containing his laughter. I grabbed the remote and switched to the local station. And there she was, Margaret Templeton, disgraced former HOA president, being led out of her house in handcuffs. Again. This time, for fraud and embezzlement. Alan slapped me on the back, laughing. Looks like Margaret's finally getting what she deserves. I watched as the camera zoomed in on her furious, humiliated face, her mouth moving a mile a minute, probably spewing excuses. I smirked. Guess the neighborhood's finally free. But here's the thing, Margaret might have been gone, but she had left a massive mess behind. And cleaning it up? That was going to take time. The next HOA meeting was held in the community center, the first one since Margaret's downfall. The energy in the room was completely different from the usual tense, miserable gatherings under her rule. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore. They were angry, yes, but they were hopeful too. Alan stood at the front, looking more confident than I'd ever seen him. All right, he said, clearing his throat. First order of business, rebuilding trust. And trust me, there was a lot to fix. Margaret had spent years abusing her power, issuing fines left and right, bullying homeowners into silence. She had used the HOA as her personal piggy bank, funneling thousands into expenses that had nothing to do with the neighborhood. Now the new board, including Alan and some other newly elected members, had to undo the damage. First, we reviewed and overturned dozens of bogus violations and refunded thousands of dollars in unfair fines. Second, we updated the bylaws, making sure no future HOA president could ever wield the kind of unchecked power Margaret had. And third, we held a vote on the most controversial topic of all. Should the HOA be dissolved entirely? The room buzzed with nervous whispers. Some people were sick of the HOA, saying it had done more harm than good. Others worried that without it, the neighborhood might fall apart. Property values could drop, maintenance might be neglected. In the end, after a heated debate, we found a middle ground. Instead of dissolving the HOA, we completely restructured it, shifting the power back to the homeowners. No more secret meetings, no more arbitrary fines, no more power-hungry tyrants calling the shots. For the first time in years, the HOA was actually working for the people. And honestly, it felt damn good. A few weeks later, as I was relaxing in my backyard, my brand new fence standing tall and proud, Alan dropped by again. He handed me a cold beer and smirked. You know, none of this would have happened without you, he said. I shrugged. I just wanted my damn fence. He laughed. Well, you got a lot more than that. You took down the worst HOA president in history and helped fix an entire community. I clinked my beer against his. Not bad for a guy who just wanted some privacy, huh? Alan grinned. Not bad at all. And as I looked out at the neighborhood, finally at peace, finally free from Margaret's grip, I knew one thing for sure. I had won, and it felt amazing.